So as the majority of people watching this will definitely know, Joyce is turning over to the professional heavyweight division ranks, working with David Haye. Joyce, he's no spring chicken. He's an older guy to be turning over as a pro. Olympic silver medalist, a guy who's campaigned in the World Series of Boxing. I think he even fought Alexander Usyk in that. And he's sort of be making a bit of a splash as he begins his career in the professional ranks. Rumours are that he is going to be campaigned fairly aggressively, and that his handlers and David Haye are going to look to move Joyce extremely quickly. There was talk that he was considering a fight with David Allen as his debut opponent. Understanding is that David Allen rejected that fight with the intention to focus more on his own career. And it now appears, due to multiple rumours online, I don't believe that the fight's actually been confirmed, but it now appears that a fight with Ian Lewison will serve as a debut opponent for Joyce. Now, I maybe haven't seen as much of Joyce as some of you will have done. I'm not someone who's followed amateur boxing or the World Series of Boxing, super closely. I've seen Joyce on a few occasions, and I've seen him in the Olympics, certainly. And my impression of Joyce was that potentially he was a high-class Derek Chisora or a high-class Jarrell Miller. So, someone of that nature. I don't view Joyce as the most fantastic outside boxer. I don't view Joyce as the guy who's going to be on his bike for 12 rounds, flicking out a jab, trying to throw flashy combinations from range. But instead, I kind of view Joyce as the guy who's going to get on his front foot, come forward, grind opponents out of there, and bring a lot of pressure, bring a lot of heat, and close down range in fights. I was one of the few people who actually didn't think his loss to Tony Yoka in the Olympics was a robbery. After that fight, the consensus really seemed to be that Joyce should have won the gold medal, and that there was some kind of miscarriage of justice based on the fact that Tony Yoka got the victory. I wasn't so sure. I did see it as a close fight, and I saw Joyce as the guy who was bringing the heat, if you like, in that contest. But I thought Tony Yoka perhaps did have a slight edge in terms of boxing class from the outside. I thought Yoka's boxing fundamentals, his jab and move, his long range work was at times in that fight certainly superior to the kind of offence that Joyce was offering. So my early impressions would be, and as I say, I haven't seen chapter and verse of this guy's career. There'll be people watching this video who've seen a lot more of Joyce than myself. But my early thoughts on Joyce would be that he's the kind of guy who could potentially look good against a lower calibre of opponent. He's the kind of guy who could maybe walk through to English, British level relatively easy. But when he gets to that sort of level, and when maybe his power isn't the only contributing factor in a fight, I wonder if he would be vulnerable to a guy who is an outside fighter, to a guy who's got a jab, to a guy who's a bit slick, and to a guy who can move and get his offence off. And because of all of those factors, I'm not so sure that Ian Lewison is a great debut opponent for Joyce. Now, I've had Ian Lewison on this channel before. I've interviewed him on the channel, and maybe we'll do that again if this fight is announced. If Ian's so good to give up the time. But I'm not saying that out of pure bias. I actually think stylistically, based on the limited footage of Joyce I've seen, Ian Lewison could be a real problem for him. We remember that kind of Dillian Whyte fight, and in that fight, Lewison turned up in pretty poor condition. He hadn't had a full training camp. He turned up very heavy. But he showed an immense amount of schooling and calm in there against Dillian Whyte. He showed an excellent chin. He's not someone who's going to get blown out on a round or two. And he showed someone who was quite defensively aware, quite slick, quite slippery, and could really get some decent long-range punches put together. Now, the problem with Ian Lewison is his punch output, and that relates to his fitness. If he could fight like he did against Dillian Whyte in the first round or second round for 12 3-minute rounds, he'd be a real handful. He'd be someone who would be a British champion, certainly en route to a European level, in my belief. But you know, against a guy like Joe Joyce, who's got all that hype, all that momentum. Joyce has been sparring top quality professionals. I mean, there's all sorts of talk about him sparring. I think he sparred Hughie Fury, sparring with Joshua, and obviously there's going to be a huge amount of hype behind him. So Joe Joyce will, you know, turn up in very, very good nick. And if Ian Lewison turns up unfit, out of shape, a guy like Joe Joyce may just have too much upside to get him beat. But hopefully Ian Lewison's got a bit of notice for this fight. I mean, we're talking about it now and it hasn't even been announced. So if Ian Lewison's been aware of this news for several weeks, and if he's been training away and trying to get his weight down and get himself into physical condition, I really do think he could cause Joe Joyce problems. And based on what I've seen from Joe Joyce so far, I would say it's no certainty whatsoever that Joe Joyce beats Ian Lewison. You know, at this stage, I would say it's no certainty that Joe Joyce definitely gets the nod over Ian Lewison at this stage if Ian Lewison turns up in nick. Now, Ian Lewison turning up in great nick for a fight is something that we haven't seen for a pretty substantial amount of time. So I'm not saying that that's a certainty, but I think it's a very, very ambitious start. Yeah, we saw what happened with Vasyl Lomachenko, where he stepped up to world title level in only his second amateur fight, and really he got out-hustled in that fight by a more experienced pro. Now, I'm not saying that Ian Lewison is necessarily Orlando Salido, but then again, I don't think Joe Joyce is necessarily Vasyl Lomachenko in terms of skill set. And you know, I just wonder if this is over ambitious. You know, a guy like Ian Lewison. I mean, when did Dillian Whyte fight him? 15 fights, 20 fights, something, you know, something of that nature. I think someone like Joe Joyce, you'd want to maybe give 2 or 3 preps ahead of going into a contest with Ian Lewison. Lewison's got a bit of power on his own. He's got a good chin. He's not someone you're going to blow out of there. And he's got some really, really decent and underrated skills and defensive attributes as well. So I have concerns about this matchup from a Joe Joyce perspective. I really do. If the fight is over a shorter distance, if it's over 6 rounds or 8 rounds, for example, and Ian Lewison turns up really, really willing to box his heart out for the first half of the fight, yeah, maybe he can even spring an upset here. I don't think that's absolutely crazy. Yeah, I've compared Joe Joyce to a Derek Chisora type fighter. I think Lewison could outpoint a Derek Chisora over 8 rounds. I really do. So I think it's interesting. I think it's really, really interesting, and you know, we'll see if it's confirmed. But if it is confirmed, this is extremely ambitious matchmaking, and it's almost ambitious to too great a degree. You know, I know David Haye doesn't have too much history in terms of promoting bouts in the UK. I know he's recently launched his company with Richard Schaefer, and I wonder if maybe that they don't have the funding, or they don't have the TV dates to maybe build Joe Joyce to 15-0 over the course of the year. You know, it's unlikely David Haye's going to get Joe Joyce out a dozen times in his first year. So maybe they're forced to get him out and build him straight away and try and get him in real fights quite quickly, so that he's in a position where he's bringing in money and making a name for himself earlier on in his career. I don't know if that's the case. That's merely speculation on my behalf. But Joe Joyce is going to have to be pretty handy to beat Ian Lewison. You know, Gary Cornish and Sam Sexton are fighting for the British title soon. I'd pick Ian Lewison over both of those guys with a little bit in hand, actually. You know, so that's the kind of British title level, as you like it. I was actually very concerned. Dave Allen is another guy I've had on this channel several times. I was quite concerned when Dave Allen was pushing for that Ian Lewison fight. I thought Lewison may well be capable of springing the upset there, if I'm honest. So I think Lewison's underrated. And I think if he's had notice for this fight, and especially if it's not a 10-12 round fight where Lewison's potential fitness failings are going to be really, really exploited. You know, if this is an 8-round fight and Lewison's got 8 weeks notice for it, I really think Joyce is going to have to be on the top of his game, and I think he's going to have to put in a performance at least capable of winning a British title on his debut. And I'm just not 100% sure. I know he's had huge sparring, I know he's had the World Series of Boxing experience, I'm sure that's brought him on quite a bit, but the pro game's different. Lomachenko found that out early on in his career, and you know, this is extremely, extremely ambitious. Let's see if it gets announced. If it doesn't get announced and he turns up against some nobody we've never heard of, then perhaps David Haye will have heeded warnings from people like myself making videos like this. But extremely ambitious. To an extent, I'd applaud it. You know, it'd be great to have such an exciting fight on his debut. But to another extent, I feel, you know, Joe Joyce is a very, very well-touted prospect. You'd be doing more justice to him to bring him into the pro game a bit slowly and to give him some experience in the lead up to a fight of this nature. Not 20 fights, not 10 fights, but maybe 2 or 3 fights. Let me know your thoughts, people. Drop your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, do subscribe so you can check out all of my other stuff. Thanks for tuning in.